Joined from all of us. Very warm welcome to you, Manish. Today we have Professor Manish Chalana from University of Washington, who joined us specially for our internship program on adaptive reuse. And I welcome him and thank him for giving our interns this opportunity of his lecture, which is very specific on adaptive reuse. So I hope this would be a fruitful lecture for our students, and we are all looking forward to hear this. We started this internship program in June end, and the entire idea was because it's an online program, but we still wanted the students to interact with sites. So we had actually floated this program where they could pick one site near to their place and do physical examination, and we were walking them on guiding through the adaptive reuse process. So they have not had too many theoretical lectures in that sense, but they have had interactions with the site, and I think today's lecture by Professor Chalana would be very useful for all our students. So welcome, Manish, and I would, without any further delay, we would request you to give your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Shikha, and sorry, yeah, fine. Thank you, Shikha, and I'm so happy that you started this program for students. I'm guessing it has a long shelf life and would definitely be beneficial for early practitioners and students in the field of historic preservation. So I'm going to share my screen, and I'm hoping that all of you can hear me fine. If you have any questions, you can post them on the Q&A, and I believe we have some time in the end of the talk to take questions. I'd like for this to be more interactive and a more discussion session. So I'd try to wrap it up in the first 40 minutes, 45 minutes, and then so that we have some time for Q&As. So here's the screen. Let's see. I'm guessing you can all see my screen and not my notes. Okay, so just a quick introduction about myself. As Shikha mentioned, I teach in the University of Washington. We have a graduate program in historic preservation in the university. I direct that program. And more recently, I also co-direct a center called Center for Preservation and Adaptive Reuse, which is CPAR. And essentially what the center does is that it's a liaison between the university and the public. So communities that need assistances on matters of preservation, including adaptive reuse, contact us, and then we involve our students to do a range of preservation projects just to give them a more hands-on experience from practice. So this is broadly what the center does. It started right before COVID, and then because of COVID, things have slowed down a bit, but we're hoping to get it more robustly started this coming year. So in my talk today, I will focus on the theoretical underpinnings for adaptive reuse, and also discuss the range of approaches and interventions you might consider before launching into an adaptive reuse project. So in that regard, it is less about how to do sort of the nitty-gritty of brick and mortar in adaptive reuse, and more about how to take decisions about adaptive reuse projects. I'm pretty sure, as I was telling Shikha, that my namesake, Manish Da, I call him, will cover next week, the more nitty-gritty and brick and mortar of historic preservation, particularly adaptive reuse, from his vast experience as a practitioner. So bear with me as I engage the meta piece of historic preservation, particularly adaptive reuse, with you. Okay, so what is adaptive reuse? The answer is in the question, in the phrasing of the two words. First off, reuse is a bit redundant, given that the term adaptive is already in the phrase. So I often also use adaptive use, which I think has the same meaning as adaptive reuse. But since the adaptive reuse term has gained legitimacy as a phrase, we're going to continue using that without fussing on about it. So it's both an approach and a methodology of intervening into a historic fabric. Uh, uh, so oftentimes, there are other terms that are used interchangeably with adaptive reuse, including rehabilitation, retrofit, sometimes even renovation, repurposing. So there are lots of different terms that you might hear that broadly cover the same meaning as adaptive reuse. So the question is, why do we engage in this methodology? The answer is, again, not rocket science. It is because the original functions of many historic buildings are often redundant in the present time, because these buildings served a different population with different expectations and requirements in a different time. People lived differently, they engaged differently, they socialized differently. Their expectations from their personal as well as professional lives were different. So in order to continue using the buildings that were created for a different time periods, we may have to find new uses for them, uses that are obsolete, to be replaced by more contemporary uses. And then also we may need to modernize them to suit our contemporary requirements. Something as simple as air conditioning, something as simple as electricity, because oftentimes many buildings were constructed at the time when none of these were available. So what I show you, what you see here is the historic supply building in Seattle. It was built in 1904 as a commercial laundry, and it was in operation for about 80 years. So it functioned until 1985. And then, of course, it closed because laundry was seen as polluting the environment, large-scale commercial laundry, and it was banished from the urban grid. So the building closed down and sat vacant for more than a decade. As I said, the site was also contaminated with pollutants. So, but in the 1990s, Seattle emerges as the tech capital of the world. Amazon established its headquarters in the same neighborhood of this building, South Lake Union, and that brought a large, youthful, global, and affluent population to the city. And that, of course, long story short, resulted in a lot of spatial transformation of the neighborhood, and some may argue also social transformation of the city. So the supply laundry was restored and adaptively reused as part of a much larger development. It was called the Stack House apartment development. And this is the scale of the development, as you can see. Let me see if I can get a pointer. So this is, you can see here, the supply building, and it's a smokestack. Let's see. Yeah. So the supply building was part of the Stack House development, and it provided the common spaces for all these buildings. So in some sense, it was an anchor. It served as an anchor for the entire new development and held it together. You can see that its smokestack and its immediate setting became an open space for the entire development. So this is also a green rehab. Green rehab, as many of you may be familiar with, it uses less energy than a typical building of its size and function. The supply laundry building, as part of the Stack House apartment uses 50% less energy than a typical building of its size and functions. So that's something to consider when, for the students in the audience, you should really be thinking about how to merge adaptive reuse goals with goals of sustainability. That's really important. And then furthering it also to equity, if possible, but sustainability definitely, because one of the claims that adaptive reuse makes is that it is inherently sustainable, which it is, but not always, and I'll get into that. So another, why we engage in the methodology of adaptive reuse, as I said, we're trying to find new uses for old buildings or old sites, right? In the context of the United States, for those of you who are not familiar, manufacturing and industry moved out, were banished from the urban grid by World War II. So much of the manufacturing that was urban was located in the suburbs and beyond. So the cities inherited a lot of industrial buildings and a lot of factories that sat vacant without any uses. And unfortunately, majority of those were demolished because we didn't see, as even though the field of historic preservation was emerging at that time, we didn't see much aesthetic value in industrial heritage. We were more focused on preserving, the Victorian era buildings that had, in our consciousness, more aesthetic appeal. And industrial buildings, we didn't see beauty in industrial buildings. So one such industrial site was Gasworks plant in Seattle. It was decommissioned in 1950s. It used to manufacture gas from coal and eventually produce crude oil. Crude gas. So, but once that was decommissioned in the 1950s, the city acquired the site for a public park in 1962. And they hired Richard Haig to develop a master plan for the site. He was a professor in my University of Washington. And he actually retained the industrial fabric as part of the park design. He could have easily gotten rid of it. The city would have given him permits to get rid of the industrial fabric. But he integrated this so-called potentially problematic gas structure as part of the park design. And today it is a much well-loved public space in the city. It's called Gasworks Park. You should go and read more about it. And it retains the industrial fabric. It sort of embraces it. There's a children's play area in that. And then it also is a good reminder of the city's industrial past, which we tend to sort of bury and just try to present the post-industrial era, right, jumping from the Victorian times. There's a whole centuries of industrialization which left a lot of historic fabric, which has a lot of potential for adaptive reuse. So the other reasons why we engage in adaptive reuse methodology is because we appreciate historic aesthetics as a people and as a profession and professionals, but also we want to capitalize on the historic aesthetics because put very frankly, older buildings are frequently well built. They are hand built many times. They have more aesthetic appeal since they are built with care and sometimes lavish details. They are natural energy savers since they depended mostly on natural light and ventilation. They have thick walls to keep heat out, high ceilings keep the inside cool, and windows open to bring in fresh air. Right, so so certainly not. I'm not talking about the older buildings from the recent past, but older buildings from the 19th century and perhaps even the first half of the 20th century. So there's a lot of appeal of older buildings these days, especially in the US with the growing back to the city movement, where youthful populations are returning to the city, and they like the diversity and variety of the built stock. and they would often pay a premium to live in lofts and older apartments and such, right? So what you see here on the screen is 44 Union Square, which is a building that housed the Tammany Hall. Tammany Hall, long story short, it was the center. It was one of the organizations for boss politics in the U.S. So think about the movie Godfather. So the Godfather was, sort of loosely based on boss politicians. So this was one of their Tammany Hall's buildings. And then since Tammany Hall, concluded I believe in the early 20th century or mid 20th century, uh, it was repurposed into, it served as a space for many other functions, including New York Film Academy and Union Square Theater and such. But more recently, it is being repurposed as modern office and retail space. The adaptive reuse involves what you can see here, the installation of this unconventional dome structure, which has these, as you can see, diagonally intersecting glass and steel frame, which is visible from the street. I have another view of it. So I'm going to quote the firm. The firm says that the dome is, quote, meant to be both evocative uh, uh, and respectful of the building's past, while also bringing architectural spectacle to this rather staid corner of Union Square. Uh, I'll let you be the judge or as to how you feel about this addition. But to me, it does seem to be inspired by I.M. Pei's glass pyramid in Louvre. But what it has done is that the redevelopment has created a very large office space at the upper levels and retail spaces at the lower level. So in that sense, it is a more intensive rehab than it may appear. A lot of the original historic fabric of the building's interior, the guts of the building, have been taken out, and a new building is placed in its position. Uh, but but you can see that it is the adaptive reuse has brought the building to the contemporary codes, spaces that tech workers enjoy and appreciate as well as expect from office spaces, and so on and so forth. Another reason why we continue to engage in adaptive reuse is because proponents of adaptive reuse argue that it makes economic sense. So in the last 3-4 decades, reuse of old buildings have been seen as a favorable alternative to demolition or new construction. There is some empirical research that argues and establishes that recycling of older buildings make more economic sense. So in general, the cost of rehab is, some argue, is comparable to new construction. So it's definitely not going to cost you more for the same square footage. Excuse me, but proponents argue that it could cost, rehab can cost up to half the cost of new construction. So the jury is still out there on that. But there's definitely, there's need for less startup capital. The project oftentimes takes less time to complete, so you can save on time, which is money. And for that reason, the trend has continued since many historic buildings have found new purposes, and largely because also because of the focus on the urban now and the appeal of urban living and the cash value of the historic aesthetics that a lot of developers are trying to capitalize on, right? But oftentimes the reuse project can be more labor intensive, and hence can get very expensive depending on the nature of the work. They also have to, in the context of US, they would also have to rely by contemporary building codes, seismic codes as fire codes, which can add to the cost. But keep in mind, the economic benefits of adaptive reuse are scalable. And what I show you here on the screen is from research that was done in Preservation Green Lab in Seattle. It's a organization of the National Trust of Historic Preservation. And they studied 3 cities, San Francisco, Seattle, and Washington, D.C., to understand, how the older, smaller historic fabric, how it contributes to the economy of the cities. And they found a positive correlation, with adaptive reuse to, creation of jobs, to dollars generated from heritage tourism, so to more spaces for local businesses. So there is more and more empirical studies that are arguing that the economic value of adaptive reuse can be scaled, not just from the site, which of course it can also be economically beneficial at the site scale, but it can create more jobs. It can provide jobs to more non-dominant communities. It can open up spaces for diverse businesses and so on and so forth, which also have economic values. Another reason why we continue to engage in adaptive reuse as a methodology is because of environmental reasons. The greenest building is one that is already built, because you save energy when you save historic buildings, because every building has embodied energy. But embodied energy essentially is the energy consumed by all of the processes associated with the production of a building. So think about it. There's a lot that goes into creating a building in terms of materials, which are often produced using fossil fuels, transportation, again related to fossil fuels, labor, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of energy that is already used in creating buildings, right? And as it takes energy to construct new buildings, it saves energy to preserve older buildings, right? Also, construction industry is the biggest contributor of global warming. So the building industry accounts for nearly half of all the CO2 emissions, as compared to third for transportation and fifth for factories. So oftentimes, transportation is pointed out as the culprit, but it's the building industry, which is a far bigger sort of problem for CO2 emissions. So adaptive reuse has environmental benefits, of course, because it reduces waste by recycling materials and structures of existing sites. And it also keeps construction debris from filling up landfills. I believe at least more than half of the landfills in the US are full of construction debris. And they take centuries and not millennia to disintegrate. So you have to think about that. There is obviously recycling a building makes environmental sense, but oftentimes buildings are adaptive reuse uses in order to get past the regulations and to avail benefits that municipalities offers for preserving buildings, they really keep the bare minimum that is required from them to avail the incentives and bypass the regulations. So developers, of course, want to be mindful of their bottom line. So much of the historic buildings or the historic fabric gets gutted and ends up in landfill. So when you're gutting much of the building materials in the name of adaptive reuse, you cannot claim the practice to be sustainable. Unfortunately, much of adaptive reuse in the U.S. lately, the non-high style, the non-preserved buildings are relying on gutting the historic interiors, and this approach is usually referred to in literature as facadism. So essentially means retaining the street-facing facades of the building that are deemed to have some architectural or cultural values, and then putting a new building behind it. So essentially, you're just preserving two street-facing facades. Uh, this is also disruptive in the sense that the symbiotic relationship between the building's interior and exterior is disrupted because there's very little connection between the interior and exteriors. But like I said, it is getting popular because developers want to maximize on municipal incentives and bypass regulations. And of course, people are still paying to live into buildings that from the street level give the aura of historic character. So they're also making a lot of money from this. So moving on, I think in the interest of time, briefly talking about the philosophical underpinnings and the range of interventions within the scope of adaptive reuse. The philosophical underpinnings of adaptive reuse can be aligned along, the scrape versus the anti-scrape sort of discourses that were happening in 19th century Europe, which many of you are already familiar with, right? The proponent of scrape was Viola Leduc, who is known for his restoration of Notre Dame. And the anti-scrape movement was headed by William Morris. So essentially, one group said, do not touch the historic fabric, and the other group said that it's all right to contemporize the historic buildings and make them more adaptable for contemporary needs. So the scale of you can situate your project of adaptive reuse anywhere between this two extremes. One, do nothing, and one sort of have a lot of fun with the historic fabric. I'm going to quickly show you some examples of where you can launch your project. And these are things that you need to be thinking about before getting into a historic preservation project, right? What are the degrees of interventions that you want to propose for this project? What are the drivers here? Are you being driven by environmental sustainability? And if so, where would you like to place your project? Perhaps somewhere here. So here's an example of the anti-scrape sort of philosophy of adaptive reuse. So you could say that I'm going to adaptively reuse a structure, but I'm going to do very little. I'm going to maintain the historic building in its present condition. So you're going to recognize that all the changes that have taken place in the course of time of that building are part of its history. So you're going to keep all the changes and repurpose the building accordingly. So so the main thrust of your work would be something like protecting the structure from further damage. So structural conservation, if you will. What you see here is Drayton Hall. It is a fine example of Palladian house in North America. It's actually in South Carolina near Charleston. And this house had remained in the Drayton family for 7 consecutive generations, so a long time. The National Trust for Historic Preservation acquired this property in 1974, and they decided to convert the house, adaptively use the house as a house museum to interpret plantation life. But they kept the building in the way they found it, as you can see in these images, right? The Draytons never had electricity, plumbing, air conditioning, heating, nothing. And as you can see, the fireplace has been filled in here. So So the plan was, that we'll just keep the house as we found it, because we recognize that the 7 generations of history that got recorded in the spatial fabric of the house is important, and so they kept it like that. So you can see the house is very plain from inside. There's no period furnishing, and all the trust does is manage visitors as well as maintain the house from further deterioration. So that is sort of one end of the spectrum, minimal intervention. Very quickly, more minimal interventions. This is an industrial building in Denver. It's a Denver tram house powerhouse. It was constructed in 1901 to house boilers and engines used to generate electricity. Let me close the door here because there's some. So this was the building, that generated electricity. It closed in 1950s, and eventually it was used as a warehouse. But REI, the outdoor store, acquired the building in 1998 for redevelopment into its flagship Denver store. And they hired a Seattle-based architect, Mithun, for adaptively reusing this building. As you can see, much of the original fabric of the industrial building is retained in the retail repurposing. This is the retail repurposing. This is the industrial. You can see the machinery has been moved, but much of the original fabric is retained, right? Also note that the open floor plan of manufacturing and industrial buildings are awesome because they can be repurposed for many different contemporary uses. You can repurpose industrial buildings for restaurants, bookstores, dance studios, anything that you like, right? Because the floor plan allows you that type of flexibility. Of course, you might have to bring it to contemporary codes, but the building lends itself really nicely to contemporary uses. Here's a more sort of moderate intervention. This is, repurposing a building to bring it back to one important period in the life of the building. So sometimes this is important to do when a very significant period in the history remains hidden under several less important periods. It is criticized because it ignores the evolution of the building and oftentimes might present a contrived picture of the survival of the building. What I show you here is Frank Lloyd Wright's house in Oak Park, which was built by him in 1889 when he was still an employee of Louis Sullivan in Chicago. Eventually, he added a studio, and in total, he worked about for 20 years from this site until he left for Wisconsin to build Taliesin. So you can see, but after 1925, when the house was sold, subsequent owners had divided the house into 7 small apartments. And when the Frank Lloyd Wright Home and Studio Foundation acquired this property in 1974, it was in a state of disrepair. And I didn't find pictures from the inside, but it didn't look like the house that Frank Lloyd Wright lived in and developed some of the major cutting edge thinking in architecture, including the prairie style. So the trust decided that they would restore the building to 1909 when Wright lived there, and all the changes that happened after 1909 will be erased. So they adaptively retrofitted the building to the time when Frank Lloyd Wright lived in this building, and they acquired most of the historic furniture from extended family or people who had it, and recreated the house in its 1909 position. So this is considered as a moderate intervention. Very quickly, a more sort of extreme intervention would be, an adaptive reuse where you're actually reconstructing sort of the historic building, if you will. So what you see here is the site of Ben Franklin's house in Philadelphia. Ben Franklin, as you know, was an inventor, and during the bicentennial celebration of United States in 1976, and because Philadelphia was sort of the center of the independence movement, the city wanted to honor Ben Franklin. But in 1976, Ben Franklin's house was no longer there. It was a vacant site. The house had been demolished in 1812. So the house hadn't been there for almost 1.5 centuries. But it was known from oral histories that the house was 3 stories and contained 10 rooms. And there were also some foundation details of the house that was remaining. So they invited architect Robert Venturi, who you know probably, and Venturi decided to construct the metal frame that marked the volume of Ben Franklin's house. So spatially, it contained the space of the house in its outline, and through that, the visitors can then experience the house of Ben Franklin, and they can also, there are some privy pits and wells and foundation that they can look into the foundation and experience Franklin's house in that way. So this can be considered as more than a minimum, sort of more moderate to maximum intervention. Talking about approaches, you can take, there are multiple ways you can respond to historic fabric, both in the inside and outside. So I'm going to rush a little, but one of the most sort of, non-controversial approach is matching. Anything that you do matches the historic fabric that you're intervening in. So you do not differentiate as a designer. You match, you take the clues from the historic buildings. So here's an example of Boylston Avenue apartments in Seattle. It was sort of a low-income apartments, rooming houses of sort, built in 1910. You can see the small apartments in the floor plan, located in the Pike Pine district of Capitol Hill. And it was adaptively retrofitted into a hotel. And so it's not a radical new use. It was in residential use. Even the retrofitting is residential. It was repurposed into 60 units. You can see the before and after floor plans. The building was only 4 floors, or 3 and 1 in the basement. But the city they would get incentives to build another 2 floors on the top. So ultimately, they would create about 60 units on these floors. So this is called sort of matching, same style, same aesthetic, same users, right? So one is matching. The other is what you can say compatible. You're not quite matching, but you're sort of trying to create a compatible addition or adaptive reuse. So here's an example of Boston Public Library. It was constructed, in the late 19th century by McKim, Mead, and White firm, and that's the original library here. And in 1960s, the city and the library trustees realized that the library needed to be expanded. There wasn't much room for its holdings. So they invited, Philip Johnson the Great, and asked him to design the edition for the library. So this is called the Johnson edition. And you can see that the Johnson edition, of course, adds a lot of space to the library, approximately 1 million square feet of space. But you will also note that it is a classically derived modern form, right? So he uses the same granite that McKim uses. Johnson is using the same granite. The quarry was opened and the same granite was used. And it also uses arches, but interprets the arches in more sort of modern ways. So it is classically derived modern interpretation of the 20th century library, right? You can read more about it. Instead of the narrow arches of the original, there are three large bay arches. And some have argued that it is sort of, inverse of the original plan. So there are multiple ways you can address or respond to a historic context and weave in your adaptive reuse. Here, the use is much the same. Then the other approach is contrast. And this is happening outside, but it can also happen inside. This is a classic Louvre Pyramid. As you know, I'm not going to spend too much time on it. It is Ian Pei's creation in the middle, in the heart of the Louvre. Parisians, I hear, are not too fond of this pyramid. It completely contrasts the setting. But when you're in the lobby, and I've been inside, the glass actually brings in the historic context and you're surrounded by it. So in that way, I think it's a mature response. It's honest of its time. It is not trying to blend in. It is making a statement, but it's also very clever in sort of embracing the historic context and not shying from it. And you really feel it when you're in the lobby. And I just included this for fun. I call it bizarre. This is again by one of the greats, The Crystal by Daniel Libeskind. It was a multiple dollar expansion of the Museum of Ontario and in DRONAH. And you can see this is a classic Libeskind design. It is this outlandish structure, which is 25% glass, 75% aluminum, sitting on top of a steel frame. It's called Crystal. And the crystal sort of, doesn't touch the historic buildings, but it sort of, skirts around it. And it sort of integrates the circulation between the two buildings. I haven't been inside it, but it's very similar to his design in Denver and the Jewish Museum in Berlin, if you've seen those. So this is sort of outlandish, bizarre, but one could also call this as a contrast. I'll just wrap up with the urban form piece of adaptive reuse. And here I'm going to borrow from Francois Bullock's work on old buildings, new form. She's divided the adaptive reuse into 5 categories. And each of those are illustrated by these diagrams. If you can find her book and go through these. So they range from weaving, new uses and form, to all the way to juxtapositioning, new uses and form, right? So you can see how much, there's a lot of creativity that goes into this. So design, keep in mind, design is an integral piece of adaptive reuse. Because the architecture of addition and transformation is a field in itself. And unfortunately, the schools of architecture do not focus on that. It's all about new, 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 new. So, architecture of addition and transformation is more challenging, but it's also more satisfying because you're working within a frame. And while it can be frustrating to, take clues or respond, or even contrast or not respond, it can create really interesting design. So look into all these types of categories of the new and old uses and form. And I'm going to quickly show you some of the insertions. Here's an example of what is called insertion. It's actually both insertion, juxtapositioning, and knitting. So this is Trace Lofts again from Seattle. It's it was an old manufacturing sort of office building. And it was adaptively reused as a mixed-use apartment building. So 3 sites were combined. There are 2 sites here and 1, the original historic site. 3 sites were combined to create a penthouse apartment on top of this building. So this is not a gutted reuse, which is good because the old building, the interior are also preserved in the old building. The incentive, the municipal government gave the developers the penthouse floors as incentives for preserving the historic buildings, and the new buildings are inserted. Oftentimes, the new language of the new adaptive reuse is resolutely modern, but it all like IMP's intervention, but it also sort of embraces the historic fabric, right? And in the last 5 minutes, I'm going to quickly give you some examples from practice for repurposing just one type of building, because this is a humongous field. As you can imagine, all buildings of all kinds can be repurposed in so many different ways. So for the sake of this talk, I thought of just focusing on one type, which is religious buildings, and discussing how the range of possibilities in which you can reuse religious buildings, which, when you think of religious building, you don't think of a lot of options for their reuse. So in the context, I show you an image from Goa, but much of my examples are from North American context. In US, the churches are suffering from declining revenues and congregation, and the pandemic hasn't helped. Many churches have closed while others are struggling to keep open. In the last 4 decades, church attendance in the United States have gone down, certainly in the last 3 decades. Many congregations have sold their buildings to developers who are oftentimes tearing them down. Other times they're repurposing them for new users. But we've lost a lot of the religious building fabric. Roughly 1% of the nation's 350,000 congregations close every year in the United States. So that is 3,500 sites every year. And this is based on an analysis by a professor in Duke University. So churches and other religious buildings, like manufacturing, offer great opportunities for repurposing because, again, they provide open floor plans. Oftentimes, they provide elaborate and ornate details. They provide high ceilings, wonderful acoustics, lighting, and such. So lots of character, and they can lend to a variety of uses. And in the last 3 minutes, I'm just going to show you a range of uses to give you inspiration on how you can repurpose churches. This is, a church in Maastricht, Netherlands. It's dating to 13th century. But Napoleon drove that population out in the 18th century, and since then it stopped being a church and served for other uses, including a parish and a warehouse and an archives and even a giant interior parking lot for bicycles. Of course, it's Netherlands; they take their bikes seriously. So more recently, it has been repurposed as a bookstore, led by an architectural firm, Merrick and Giroud. And you can see the new installations are highlighted in these towering bookshelves, right? Which are 3 stories tall, and they can be accessed by stairs. You can see the stairs, and also by elevators. And they also have, a cafeteria in the nave, and they've done interesting things like having a table in the shape of a cross to recall the era when the structure was a church, right? So interesting ways to use a religious building as for a new function. Here's another one, a very small 16th century Basque church near Bilbao, Spain, which was, used into a residence. It had been abandoned since 1970s. The church was in need for serious repairs. The roof had caved in, lots of vegetation had invaded the structure, but you can see the small church, which I believe is only less than 190 square meter space. And it was repurposed for, a cozy modern house. So while keeping, the traces of history inside. You can see it in the materiality, you can see it in the form, So there's a lot of history in the modernization of this. Another way, a religious structure can be adaptively reused is the conversion of the abandoned synagogue in Chicago. This is Arkham Synagogue in Chicago. They're recently developed into a transit-oriented apartment building. It was originally built in 1922. You can see a dramatic stained glass lined sanctuary, lots of, it had offices, it had a commercial kitchen and various multipurposes room. But once the congregation left, the building closed its door to public in 2008, and it obviously faced an uncertain future. It was listed on the National Register of Historic Places, but as you can see, it had a lot of water damage. It suffered from vandalism, poor maintenance, and was in a poor condition. It was really a candidate for tear down. They were thinking of tearing it down. But a Chicago-based developer, bought this building and they hired space architects and planners to restore it and adaptively reuse it as 40 rental apartment units. So you can see very small apartment units, which are mostly studios and one bedroom, with a smattering of some loft style apartments in the upper floors. The building has 40 apartments, and it would also have 21 parking spaces and such. So you can see that a religious building can be converted into really interesting apartments. Another way you can think about religious buildings is in South Carolina, which is a small Methodist church being used as a cafe. Another one in Bentonville, Arkansas, another Methodist church, which is used as a resto pub called the Preacher's Son. It is actually by a business that the preacher's son created. His father used to be a preacher in this space, in this parish. So it's now a well-known, well-loved, restaurant space. Another example of, a much larger reuse of an of a religious building is by the Audible company, which is, I believe, Amazon is the parent company. So this church, Presbyterian Church in Newark, was opened in 1933 for a congregation that had remained active since 1811. And it continued to be a congregation until 1995. After that, the parish left, and long story short, Audible purchased the building, and then they, included it as part of their larger office space development. And you can see that how they juxtaposition old and new, and essentially generated 8,000 square feet of high-tech office space for its employees. And here's a view of the interiors, which honestly, you cannot provide these types of dramatic interiors in a new building. We don't have that craftsmanship. We don't have those resources. Very quickly, another church in Denver that is used as a nightclub. Much of the architecture of the church remains intact. High ceilings, which are highlighted in the lighting of the dance floor. So, and the DJ plays from the pulpit. Many traditionalist historic preservationists might frown on it because, they may see it as a blasphemous use of a religious space, but it is accepted by the patrons. And last but not the least is, a much larger effort of church redevelopment and adaptive reuse that is going on in Seattle. Seattle has a historically Black neighborhood called the Central District, and it is close to downtown Seattle. This is the neighborhood that I live in. It is fast gentrifying because, Black residents are being forced out, and more affluent residents who work for Amazon and other places are moving in. So there's an effort called the Nehemiah Initiative that's going on, and our university is involved in that. And this is an effort through which, it is church-led and community-based partnership in which the church structures are preserved, but the church sites are redeveloped for multi-purpose, residential, and other uses. So it is sort of more of a contextual historic design, plus adaptively reusing the church structure because the parish may not be there. So, the goal of it is to keep the community intact and to sort of, address historic adaptive reuse through the perspectives of equity and spatial justice. So we don't want the Black populations to be forced out of the neighborhood. So the city is partnering with this so that the church sites can be preserved and offer new uses. And finally, the reason why adaptive reuse continues to hold as a methodology is because it has relevance today, especially from the environmental perspective. But as I talked about, it has huge cachet for aesthetics. The thing that practitioners and the students in the audience that you need to be thinking about is how do you control for gentrification in high-end users? Because oftentimes adaptive reuse, brings in high-end users, and you can see that in Pondicherry and Cochin as well, and that takes away the spaces from residents and everyday users. So while we need to strive for sustainability, we should also be thinking about how that sustainability can be achieved by, in more equitable and socially conscious ways, and how it can be less disruptive to the populations and the residents of the neighborhood. And again, design is critical and fundamental in the transformation and repurposing of the buildings. So thank you very much. I see lots of chatter in the chat that I haven't kept track of. So thank you. I'm happy to take questions.
So thank you, Manish. That was really very informative, and a range of examples which covers everything from industrial to modern heritage, as well as churches and religious heritage, which is very relevant for the Indian context for sure. So I see two questions. I see a lot of appreciation in the chat box, and I see two questions. So I will start with the first one. That's from Pooja Agarwal. And she says, how do you maintain a balance between adaptive reuse and commercialization of a heritage property? As most of the times in India, heritage is reused as revenue earning ventures.
That's a very good question, Pooja, and I briefly touched upon that towards the end of the talk, right? Because how do you keep the historic fabric relevant in contemporary times? There's a huge investment, even in adaptive reuse projects, as you can imagine, right? It is sometimes at par with new construction. So lots of money has to be invested, and people who are investing money are concerned with the revenue generation, and we need to be finding new users that can generate that revenue. And unfortunately, a lot of that is takes form of commercial retail or boutique hotels and high-end users. So adaptive reuse has been criticized for furthering gentrification. And I really don't have answers for that, but Manish Da will cover next week about how you can, retrofit buildings for the same users. So that's one possibility, right? You can maintain a church as a church, perhaps a different denomination, perhaps a different parish. So it is not so much adaptive reuse. It is then perhaps just continuing the use. But it's a tough question you ask, and I'd love to get the views of the audience. How do you maintain the balance? The city of Seattle, I can share with you, is now addressing this through their a program that they call HALA, which is a housing affordability legislation. So they are giving incentives for adaptive reuse projects. So let's say you find an old building and you propose that you're going to create apartments in this old building, say a church. And the FAR of that would allow you only 7 apartments. The city will then give you an additional maybe 3 apartments to incentivize your project. Sometimes they would also give you tax breaks and say that your property taxes are not going to go up, which in a city like Seattle they go up rapidly every year. They'll say your property taxes would not go up for 10 years, right? So you get a flat property tax for 10 years. So there are multiple ways in which you can sort of incentivize. The developers now in Seattle have to pay a fee, what they call affordable housing fee, for all the adaptive reuse projects in which they do not provide affordable housing. So they have the option to not provide, and get away with it, but they would have to pay a fee to the city, so the city can then use that money to develop affordable housing somewhere else. So lots of ways in which municipalities are thinking of bringing a balanced approach, but we're certainly not there yet. I hope that begins to answer your question.
Yeah, I think it does to a large extent. We also have input from Mrs. Sumit Kaur, who says TDR is a concept used to preserve churches' heritage in Manhattan.
Mm.
And
That's a good point, Sumitji. In fact, one of the examples of the synagogue that I used from Chicago, that is the transfer of development rights. That's a good point. That's also the cities are doing that. You can sell the air rights at market value. So let's say the zoning changes in a neighborhood, and the original zoning was manufacturing, and the building could only go up ground plus 1, 36 feet, but the zoning changes to 65 feet, and the FAR changes. So the portion of the air that you cannot develop for historic properties, you can sell that development rights to a different zone in the city for market value. That is transfer of development rights. Then there's also TDR. No, that's transfer of development right. And then there's transit-oriented development, TOD, and historic preservation. So if you are in Los Angeles and other cities, if you're developing, repurposing a historic building, which is dependent on a public transit and not on your personal vehicle, you can get incentives from the city to either more density and more FAR, or you can get other types of incentives. So yeah, there are multiple ways in which those are ongoing.
And there's one question from Brinda Singh. She wants to know if the extreme interventions can go hand in hand with the sustainability goals of adaptive reuse.
I would think so. I would think so. As bizarre as the extreme interventions might look, they could go hand in hand with environmental sustainability. That is really not my area of materiality, but I believe there's a huge, advancement made in the technology of materials. So entire buildings can be crafted out of recycled materials, so there's a growing area of green rehab. And the LEED certification in the US now has a provision for adaptive reuse. So you can get additional points if you are adaptively reusing a structure. And again, keeping the historic interiors in place and not gutting, because the extreme, you're right, the extreme one, or if by extreme you mean gutting the interiors, then I would say no. It's difficult because if you're entirely pulling out the skeletons or the innards of the buildings, and perhaps you're recycling some of the fixtures and some of the interesting details, but much of it is going to end up in landfill, which would take eons to disintegrate. So if you mean by even if the replacement is green, then you do your checks and balances and see how green that really is, because you pulled out the green building, which was already there with embodied energy, and you replaced it with a green building. But there's still there's a net loss there, and I'm sure people have studied that. So yes, it can happen, but I don't know the extent to which that would be successful.
So,
I see a couple of hands, Shikha.
yeah. Can
Yaminis and Kakolis.
Kakoli wants to do that. Samvita, can we unmute her?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you, Kakoli.
Yeah, and that was a lovely presentation. Thank you so much. I am Kakoli and I'm from Pondicherry. And I just wanted to, because you made a reference to Pondicherry and the kind of high-end adaptive reuse buildings that are happening here. Just to put it in a little brief context, we have two kinds of buildings in Pondicherry. We have public buildings, which are the schools, the churches, the real authentic heritage buildings which need to be restored. And then we have private houses. We have the French precinct, we have the Tamil precinct. Now, what is happening is that obviously people who have the money to invest in restoring or recreating the houses in the French precinct are doing it from a tourist point of view, and as a result of which our tourism has increased, and Pondicherry is now on a heritage map, kind of a tourist thing. And yes, it is definitely better than what it was a few years before. But then there are no incentives from the government whatsoever for private houses to restore, as a result of which Tamil houses or people who don't have that kind of a vision or the money, they're not interested in restoring their houses. So most of the Tamil houses are probably getting broken down and little apartments are coming up there. Now, in this context, isn't it valid that what is happening in Pondicherry is still worth a lot, but or maybe it is not. I mean, tell me if you are going wrong in the way we are proceeding with what's happening in Pondicherry. Love to hear your view on that.
Thanks for that question, Kakoli. I'm familiar with both the French areas and the Tamil areas of Pondicherry, and they're both very interesting precincts. And you're right. We in the Indian context, much of the revenue and resources for historic preservation unfortunately is funneled for the high styled and the monumental and the public buildings, right? And we can be critical about that, but we also have to sort of accept it because we have so many of those, right? So we need to first figure out what do we do with these buildings before launching onto the residential private building. But they don't have to be either or. They can go simultaneously, as it happened in the US. How did since I'm drawing a lot from the US context, I'll share with you how that was mobilized in the US. In the US, when the Historic Preservation Act was passed in 1966, which is recognized as the National Historic Preservation Act, right? One of the provisions was in that act was the tax credits, right? So it meant that if you were adaptively reusing an old building, just an old building, it didn't have to be even listed on the historic register, or it had to be recognized at any level. An old building, if you were investing in the upkeep of that old building for, I think the provision was also revenue generation. So there was a revenue thing there also. But it could be mixed uses. You could have a bakery in the first floor and live on the second floor. You could, get your taxes waived for the entire restoration project. So that got a lot of people in the business of preservation, if you will. So it was not out of love of history per se.
Right.
It made business sense. It made business sense that, oh, let's do it. We're going to save 150,000 in taxes, right? And we
Yeah.
could use that. It's essentially going to be a free sort of upgrade for us. So a lot of that everyday private architecture got preserved that way. So one way to look at it is, you can say, but that's a long range vision that, let them do what they're doing in the French district of Pondicherry now, right? Because of course, heritage tourism has an economic value for the
Absolutely.
community.
Yeah.
So, it seeps out of that neighborhood, even in the Tamil area where you
Mm.
spend money and you go around. So you can see that once that market is saturated, right, there will be other spaces that will open up. But then some others would argue that that's such a slow process. And in the meantime, we may lose a lot of interesting fabric in the Tamil areas.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
So the city of Pondicherry really has to provide incentives, and it could be as I know that the taxes are more loosely sort of loosely generate revenue for the cities, but they could think about ways in which they could start by incentivizing a little, perhaps giving them an additional floor,
Yeah.
and then having them, giving them additional FAR, but having the new design and adaptive reuse go through a design review process,
Right.
where
Yeah.
much of the historic fabric would have to be retained. The more you retain, the more FAR you get on a sliding scale, because Seattle learned from that. What I showed you, remember the facadism that happened?
Yes.
Is
Yes.
because it was just one size fit all. So
Yeah.
you could get either, if you saved the entire building, you got the same revenue, and even if you saved just two walls, you got the same incentives. So
Yeah.
of course, developers saved only the bare minimum because they wanted to, maximize their profit. But now that legislation has changed. Now there is more nuance in that legislation, and say if you save more, you get more. If you save less, you get less.
Yeah,
So,
that makes so much sense. Yeah.
so
Yeah. Thank you so much. That helps for sure.
yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So thank you, Manish. I think we have responded to all the raised hands and the questions.
I see, Shikha, I see two more raised hands. I'm happy to take those questions. Yamini and Anand Raj.
Samvida, can you? Samvida,
Maybe
yeah.
Yeah. Hello, sir. I'm Anand Raj Chaudhary.
hi.
I have a question regarding to you have mentioned that as in USA there has been a trend of closing lots of churches and they are being repurposed. What I have noticed here in India, there are many mining towns are being closed, and what can be done to all these mining sites? That's a question I have.
That's a good question, and it ties down to our association with history, right? As a culture, as a society, we do not take to industrial aesthetics and heritage, right? We do not see value in industrial past, including mining, right? And that's why there's a reluctance to preserve it, because we don't, and oftentimes also repurposing those buildings can be very difficult. And there's literature on this. If I'm getting the name right, I think there's a book by Francaviglia called Hardscapes. Let me see. And I will send you that. And he looked into mining sites and how those can be preserved. An example that comes to mind is also look up Butte, Montana in the US, Buttee. And also look up Francoviglia's work on hard. It's called Hard Places. Let me put this in the chat for you. I read this book in grad school, and since then I haven't, because I wasn't interested in the mining heritage, and I proposed a master plan for for furnaces in central Pennsylvania. That was my master's thesis. I was really intrigued by mining landscape. So I've studied that, and Franco Viglia's book is really helpful for that. So I would say look that up, and he's given multiple examples in which you can use or reimagine mining sites. Oftentimes, again, for tourism, but also for housing. And then in Butte, Montana, there is also tours of the mining site, so you can integrate it with heritage tourism. I'm sure it has potential for India, because we have so many mining heritage, especially in Jharkhand and other places, and people would like to know about its history. So I'm going to send you those resources. I cannot find I don't know how to. Okay, chat box is here, so I'll put that there, and then you can look it up. That's the book I was talking about, and then Butte, Montana. I hope that helps.
Thank you, sir.
Any more raised hands?
Just mine, Shikha.
Yeah, please, Yamini.
Hi. Hi, Manish. It's really great to see you and to hear that really rich and informative talk. Thank you for that.
Thank you, Yamini.
Yeah, I have my question is just a slight lateral movement from there. I'm a historian, so I was just wondering at the disciplinary level. I've worked on various adaptive reuse projects, and this question has been going around in my head for a number of years now. Is there a role for history, the discipline of history, in working through an adaptive reuse project, particularly because for us as historians, a building is literally living history, right? I mean, if the element of history is time, chronology, then we have it's literally a building is a museum or an exhibition of the passage of time. It's an expression of the passage of time, not an exhibition, sorry. So I was just wondering, how history, and I'm not talking about, just kind of a flat narrative history, which, typically accompanies projects, but a more rich, discursive, histories, using critical inquiries, using, cross references and so on, a richer historical discussion being part of adaptive reuse projects when you are discussing, different layers of time. I was just wondering if there's any example of that anywhere, or is that even possible?
That's a great question, Yamini, and good to see you here virtually. And while I have this stage, I'm going to plug in our book, in which we just published an edited volume through Routledge called Heritage Conservation in Post-Colonial India, and Yamini has a wonderful piece on that, as well as Shikha. So others also probably in the audience that I don't see have pieces in that. So take a look at that. But to answer your question, yeah, oftentimes adaptive reuse is commercially driven, even in the US, right? Because private developers are involved, right. And to be honest, they do not care much about the intersecting layers of history, the interesting past, and what the building, as you say, what the layers can convey individually and collectively about the building. Right. So, but having said that, there are some buildings that have been repurposed that engage in the history, the history of the building in wonderful ways. And one example that comes to mind, which you may already be familiar with, Yamini, is the Tenement Museum in Lower East Side in New York.
Right.
right? So it actually preserves a tenement,
Right.
2 or 3 tenements without sanitizing. Of course, sanitized because it doesn't have all the filth and smells, but spatially same, furnishing the same, everything the same, and they have the visitors go through the different tenements, and then they take the perspective of immigrant communities, women, and their lives in those tenements. Right. So I believe it's easier. What you're saying is much easier to do if you are repurposing the building for educational purposes or museum purposes.
Right.
But not, for instance, say if you're creating a restaurant from a church. Well, you could still do that. Like the preacher's son that I talked about, the preacher's son restaurant. He is actually the son of the preacher who used to, work in that parish. And so some of that history gets conveyed through just the name of the establishment, but also, as sort of shallow it may sound, names of food and drinks and such, right? So there are ways to do that and make it more playful, perhaps, but not super shallow.
Right.
So I think there is another book that's coming to, that's escaping my mind. So scholars have looked into this to engage the history of the building in the adaptive reuse project. So I think, to answer your question, yes, historians are, I don't think preservationists can do without historians. And that's the problem, a bit of a problem in India, because preservationists are not trained as historians. And a building oftentimes has really interesting facets and details that require research that only a historian is trained to do. And in the US, historians are definitely part of all historic reuse projects.
Right.
I hope that begins to answer
Yes,
your question.
it does begin to answer. We'll discuss it when we meet next, Manish.
Yeah, sure. Thank you for participating.
Thank you.
I see Ritu. Hi, Ritu.
I
I haven't seen you in 30 years.
Yes, that is the reason I just raised the hand to see you and meet you and greet you.
Right.
And
Good to see you.
good to see, and good to see the way you have progressed, and congratulations for the talk. Yeah, I joined in late, so I cannot comment much on it, but I really appreciate the way you have been presenting. I have been in some other forums as well, so very what you're doing.
Yeah, thank you. Good to see you after such a long time.
Yes. So let's.
Shika, I think we've answered all the questions. If there are questions in the Q&A that weren't answered, please email them to me. I'll think about those, and if there are any, I think Shika, you're keeping track of that. So
yeah, I think most of the questions are answered. Most others are appreciation. Well, there's one question by Sanjay Dhar, which says, does grading of the building not achieve the objective of preserving history? Okay, it's actually a statement, so not really question. And then just appreciation from Poonam has asked, Poonam Verma, the politics of place is another, another session. So maybe we'll do one.
that's a round table. Hi, Smita. Hi, Poonam. There's so many familiar faces. Yeah, good to see you all.
It's lovely to hear you talk, and of course, adaptive reuse is my favorite subject.
Yeah.
And
next time, Shikha, we should hold a round table, because then
I'll get, I mean, this was, of course, our interns who really found it useful. Anand Raj was one of the interns. He's actually doing a reuse of a church in Pondicherry. I just saw that. So I think they found it very useful, but of course the others are all our colleagues and friends, and they've also really enjoyed your lecture. So maybe we'll have another session with them, with a panel and more discussions. So thank you, everyone. And thank you, Manish. We really appreciate
it. Thank you. Hi, everybody. Yeah, see you around. Hopefully in person, not virtually soon. So keep in touch.
Let's
Yeah.
hope so. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Yeah.